Look at this. 2.3 million blocks of solid stone. Some of them weigh as much as a commercial airplane, stacked over 480 feet high. How did they do it? Aliens? Magic? The real answer is far more fascinating, because they didn't even have wheels, or pulleys, or iron tools to understand how they built the Great Pyramid. We have to bust a massive myth. You've probably heard that slaves built the pyramids. That is entirely false. The pyramid was actually a massive public works project, built by skilled, highly paid workers. But why did they have the time to do it? Because of the Nile River. Every year the Nile flooded, covering all the farmlands in water. Farmers couldn't grow crops for months, so the pharaoh offered them a deal. Work on the pyramid and you'll get food, beer and housing. It was the ultimate jobs program. Okay, so you have the workforce. But how do you actually get the stone? Most of the pyramid is made of limestone, conveniently located right next to the build site. But limestone is hard, and the Egyptians only had tools made of copper. Copper is a very soft metal. If you hit limestone with a copper chisel, the chisel just blunts. So how did they cut millions of blocks? They used a genius trick. They added sand. When you pour wet sand under a copper saw, the copper doesn't cut the stone, the sand does. The hard quartz crystals in the sand act like sandpaper, slowly grinding a perfect groove into the limestone. Then they jam wooden wedges into the groove, pour water over the wood. The wood expands and crack. The block splits. But what about the inner chambers? They used red granite for the pharaoh's burial chamber. Granite is much harder than limestone, and the only granite quarry was in Aswan, 500 miles away from the pyramid. These blocks weighed up to 80 tons. How do you move an 80-ton rock 500 miles? Boats? They put them on massive wooden barges. But wait, if you drop an 80-ton block onto a wooden boat, it sinks. So how did they load the boats? They dug a canal under the stone before the flood season, placed the boat in the dry canal, underneath the block, and waited for the Nile to flood. The rising water lifted the boat up, perfectly catching the stone. No lifting required, just physics. They floated the stones right to the base of the pyramid. But now they face a massive problem. The stone is on land, and they still don't have wheels to move it over the sand. So they used wooden sledges. Basically, giant snow sleds, but for sand. But try pulling a heavy sled over dry sand. The sand builds up in front of the runners. It creates friction. It becomes impossible to pull. For decades, historians had no idea how they solved this, until they looked closely at an ancient tomb painting. It showed a guy standing at the very front of the sled, pouring a liquid onto the sand, water. Physicists tested this recently and were blown away. When you add exactly the right amount of water to sand, micro droplets form bridges between the grains. It makes the sand twice as stiff. It prevents sand from building up in front of the sled, cutting the pulling force required in half. So they moved the blocks to the base. But now, the biggest mystery of all. How do you go up 480 feet into the air without cranes? The traditional answer is a ramp. But this creates a fatal engineering problem. To build a straight ramp to the top of the pyramid, the slope has to be gentle enough for men to pull a block. If it's too steep, the block slides backwards. So, a gentle ramp reaching 480 feet high would have to be over a mile long. It would require more material than the pyramid itself. That makes no sense. What about a spiral ramp wrapping around the outside? That solves the volume problem. But imagine pulling a multi-ton block on a sled and trying to turn a 90-degree corner. You can't pivot a sled easily. Enter French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin. He proposed a radical theory. The ramp wasn't on the outside, it was on the inside. An internal spiral ramp built directly into the stone. This allows for a gentle slope without needing extra dirt. And at the corners, they left open notches. A wooden crane in the notch would physically rotate the block, solving the corner turning problem entirely. In 2015, researchers did thermal scans of the Great Pyramid. They found a spiral shape of varying temperatures, matching the internal ramp theory almost perfectly. Okay, so they can get the blocks up. But building a pyramid requires insane precision. The base of the Great Pyramid is level to within an inch, across 13 acres of desert. How do you level land that perfectly without modern tools? They used water. They dug a grid of shallow trenches into the bedrock, filled the trenches with water. Water always finds a perfect level. Then they cut the rock down until it matched the waterline. Boom. A perfectly level 13-acre foundation. Next problem, alignment. The pyramid is aligned to true north with mind-boggling accuracy. Better than the Royal Observatory in London. But they didn't have magnetic compasses. They used the stars. Specifically, a ritual called the stretching of the cord. They observed where a specific star rose in the east and where it set in the west. By bisecting the angle between those 2 points, they found perfect true north. So the base is level, aligned, and the core is stacked. But this isn't what the pyramid looked like. The final step was the casing stones. They covered the entire pyramid in pure white Tura limestone, polished so smooth it reflected the sun like a mirror. It would have been blinding to look at, visible from mountains miles away. And at the very top, the pyramidion, a solid capstone, likely covered in gold or electrum, catching the first light of dawn. The Great Pyramid stood intact for nearly 4,000 years, until earthquakes loosened the casing stones, and humans scavenged them to build the city of Cairo, leaving the rough stepped core we see today. It is easy to look at the pyramids and think of aliens, because our modern brains struggle with deep time. To put it in perspective, Cleopatra lived closer in time to the invention of the iPhone than she did to the building of the Great Pyramid. The pyramid was ancient history, even to the ancient Egyptians. It wasn't magic, it wasn't extraterrestrials. It was just humanity using math, organisation, and sheer will to build something that would outlast time itself.